All right, happy to be here with you today. It's too bad we couldn't be in person, but this will still be fun. So today we're going to talk about passing the technical interview. First off, he already told you some basics about me. I'll cut to the point of what's relevant to you today. So I'm a staff engineer at Wayfair. We build development platforms in my team for thousands of engineers. I've previously been a CTO and a senior engineer at other companies. And so throughout the process of my career, I've been responsible for creating many interviews, both the interviews themselves and the entire interview process. And then personally, I have the experience of interviewing dozens of engineers for these jobs over the years, and then being an interviewee myself. And so today we're going to cover the technical interview process from phone screen to offer, and we're not going to cover anything before the phone screen. So resumes, cover letters, applications, recruiters, things like that, those will be out of scope for this talk. Searching for a job or changing jobs is a pretty scary process. And so I'm hoping that this talk can help demystify that process just a bit for you and help you be better prepared for your next job search. Let's talk a little bit about my last job search. So I had not interviewed for a job in many years. The last 3 jobs I had gotten were via referrals. So I'd only had a brief interview process for these. And with this last job search process, it's actually the one that landed me here at Wayfair, I decided to focus on larger companies. I wanted to experience issues at larger scale and get some more experience with these larger companies since I had mostly done startups the last few years. The interview process at large tech companies is different than startups, right? It's very laid out, very structured, very Google style or LeetCode style of a process. And in my opinion, it's not super similar to the work you do every day. It focuses on signaling for problem solving and coming up with scalable solutions under pressure. And now today we're going to walk through this as an example of your next job search. So we're going to walk through a fake job search process. And this won't be 100% accurate across every company, but it should be pretty similar to what you're going to see. And we're going to focus the examples to those as a senior engineer. As you, if you're before a senior engineer level, then the problems probably won't be as in-depth or as difficult, but they'll be very similar. If you're above a senior engineer, then they'll be similar, but you'll need a better connection to the business or to the product. Now, one thing I'm going to stress a lot today is prep and how you prep for this. I personally advocated against prepping for a long time. So I've been not a fan of the very formal interview process. I don't think it necessarily reflects your ability to do the job as much as it reflects your ability to do the interview process and handle pressure well. So when I was going through this last interview, at first I made it a point to not prep for most any of my interviews. And my thinking was, if it's a good fit, then it'll just be a natural fit. And that was until I was in the middle of the interview with a FANG company, and I was talking to the interviewer. We were just chatting. I was complaining about the process. He was complaining about the process. But then he said something that changed my perspective. He said, the interview process is a way to filter for people that want the job enough to prep for the interview. And that was my reaction. Well, I definitely didn't prep enough for this interview. So after this, I changed my perspective on it. I decided to put a reasonable amount of effort into prepping and into the process. I still don't necessarily love it, but it's the world we live in, and so you want to excel at this. This is what the funnel looks like for most interview processes. It's going to vary a little bit from company to company, but the larger companies are going to look a lot like this. So you're going to have a phone screen, a manager phone screen, a coding test, which is usually online, and then an on-site eval. The on-site eval will be broken into multiple sections. And before any of this starts, you're going to have the phase 0. So that's where we're going to start. You've applied to a position at Acme Corp. The recruiter reaches back out. They love your resume. They want to schedule a phone screen. It's for a senior software engineer position working on their content management system. So we're on to the phone screen portion of the funnel. The phone screen with the recruiter is going to be a high level. It's probably with the recruiter or someone from HR. The larger the company is, the more likely they are to have an in-house recruiter. It's going to be high level questions, not technically in depth, but there might be some basic qualifiers on your technical ability. They'll pitch you on the role and usually give you some info about the team and the company. So how do you prep for this? Really, you want to have a good story for why you're looking. You want to have a good example of what your career progression has been and what types of problems you enjoy solving. So you can show end to end how you got to where you are today. For my own personal prep, I prepped a bunch of examples, structures of the teams I've been on, favorite projects I had worked on, and what my role was in those projects. I also like to go ahead and get the money conversation out of the way early here. So the recruiter's not going to be offended if you bring up money. Just try to get a range of the total compensation. Don't try to get into the weeds of exactly what you would be paid or how. You just want to gauge, is this interview worth my time? Is it worth going through the process? You're easily going to spend 10 hours end to end through an interview process. There's no point in wasting your time or the company's time if you're going to be vastly out of sync in pay. A lot of people worry about this disqualifying them, so they don't want to seem like they're money hungry or greedy or whatever. But really, if the company says, we only want people that aren't motivated by the money, then that's probably not a place you want to work. They're not treating you like a professional. All right, so you get through the phone screen, you hear back from the recruiter. Success, they want to move on. The next step is the manager screen. So this is going to stay high level, but it will be deeper technically. It's going to be pretty similar to the recruiter phone screen. This is a good opportunity to ask questions, right? So you're talking to who will likely be your boss once you go in here. So this is a great place to filter out companies that you don't want to work for. This will be a behavioral interview, and it's disguised as a conversation. It's going to be very casual, so be comfortable, but keep in mind that you need to be professional here. How do you prep for this? Have stories for hard problems you've worked on, projects you're proud of, what your role was in solving those. Stories for the failures you've experienced, what you learned from them, and be prepared to discuss technology you've used and your decision process behind choosing those technologies. Personally, I prepped a bunch of examples of newer technology I've used and the trade-offs that I found with using them. All right, so you hear back. The hiring manager thought you did great. You're on to the next step. Next step here is a coding test. So this will usually be either a take-home test or a live coding test by some kind of online platform. This might be proctored or it might be graded automatically. This proctored is usually going to be an engineer that works at the company walking through the test with you. Now, if this take-home is probably going to be a small project, something less than 4 hours to complete. Some examples are, design an architecture for a web application that does X with Y scales to Z users, or design a RESTful API for processing concert tickets, or implement bubble sort on this data set in ON time. If it's an online platform, it's going to be a little more interactive. You'll be typing in real time, and it's going to be recorded usually. So usually this will be a small problem that takes less than an hour to complete. It'll be algorithmic, and you'll have to define the complexity once you're done. Oftentimes this is the proctored version, and a lot of times the questions will be iterative. So they'll build on each one, and you'll evolve it over the process. You might see some variations on this that test for also object-oriented programming ability, or API knowledge, or language-specific knowledge. How do you prep for this one? So this is when things get a little harder, right? So this is a light version of the Coding and System Design on-site evals you'll see. And this is also going to test your real-world experience. So you can only prep so much for this. The system design and architecture parts of this are going to really depend a lot on the role you're interviewing for. So I can only give you so much advice here. You need to sit down and think through what will they want me to know for this position and for this role. So if it's a DevOps role, you should probably know about servers, pipelines, Kubernetes, things like that. If it's a senior web developer role, you should probably know how to set up web servers, databases, how to scale them. Or if you're doing something specific, maybe you're doing like a large scale logging infrastructure support role, you should know a lot about the tech they're using there. You can get a lot of knowledge from the job posting here usually on the exact tech they'll be using. The system design won't be about the tech per se, as much as do you understand how to architect a large scale system. Also, you want to know about APIs. If it's any type of web development related job, you'll want to know about RESTful APIs, GraphQL, RPC. You'll want to be able to design an API from scratch and develop open API schemas, things like that. You'll want to know some common data structures and their uses. These are the most common data structures I've seen used. And just keep in mind that hash tables solve a lot of problems. Hash tables and arrays are probably the most common data structures that you'll see. Prepare and be ready with some common techniques for solving algorithms. The basic technique you need to know is that you brute force the solution first, get it working, and then you can optimize it and do iterations on it after that. Be ready to pattern match algos for problems you've seen in the past. So a lot of problems will be described in slightly different ways, but if you break them down into the pieces that you need to accomplish what you're doing, you'll probably be able to pattern match to something you've solved in the past and solve it faster rather than trying to use first principles to solve the whole problem. Be aware of some common problems you'll see and get very comfortable solving these problems. So you'll see FizzBuzz, 8 queens, Boggle, success sum, or just basic string manipulation questions pretty often. Be ready to make improvements for performance. Now, the interviewer might ask you for this, and if they don't, you should try to do this on your own, assuming you have time. Be ready to question your data structure choices, apply different data structures, and see if it gets more clear. Once you solve the problem 100% with a brute force solution, then iterate on it and try to make it faster and more performant. One key here is to not go for the most performant solution first. So it's better to solve the problem 100% with a brute force solution than it is to only get through 50% of the problem with the most performant solution. Be aware of some common sorting techniques. Make sure you know when and why you use each, their performance characteristics, etc. And then really sit down, write down, think about your knowledge gaps and try to fill those. So for example, in this last job search, I knew that GraphQL is very popular, but it's not something I've used much. So I spent a lot of time getting familiar with it, getting comfortable learning about it. I've also made a list of other things like this that I knew were popular now that maybe were a gap in my knowledge. A good way to do this is to look at job listings for jobs you want and then note down the technologies they require. And then practice solving algorithm problems very often. I practice with a lot of LeetCode and HackerRank. The quick solving of the algo-based problems are hardest for me. So I had to build up a cache in my brain of common problems so that I could quickly pattern match against those. All right, so you did it. You passed the coding test. Now we're on to the last step, which is the on-site eval. So this is where things ratchet up even harder. So the on-site, or not so on-site right now, right, is usually 4 to 6 hours. If you're not local, you'll fly in. And as a senior engineer, it'd be pretty normal for you to get flown in. This next step is filtering for technical ability, plus culture fit, plus whatever else the company cares about. So usually it's a 1 to 2 coding test, 1 to 2 behavioral interviews, and at least 1 system design interview. So for our example here, you're flying into Acme Corp. You're going to arrive Thursday night. The interview starts at 9 a.m. on Friday. Be smart about this. Go to bed early. Take it easy on food or booze. Get up early. Get a nice, well-rounded breakfast. Don't eat too much, but make sure you have fuel so that you can think under pressure. Arrive early. You don't want to be stressed when you get there from being lost. This is what your schedule looks like the day of your on-site. So you're going to have 10 minutes at the end of each interview to ask questions back. Make sure you have questions ready to ask here. If you have a good recruiter, you'll probably have a list of each interviewer's name against his schedule. And I usually go through and just look them up on LinkedIn and try to prep some questions to ask them based on their experience and what they know. This is going to be a long day, so be prepared. Also, I'll throw out, enjoy it. This is a great experience. You're going and you're meeting incredibly intelligent people and going through an exclusive process. Make sure to have fun. So you arrive, you meet with the recruiter. This will be casual. They'll show you the basics and show you where to go. Next up, you'll meet the hiring manager. So this is a behavioral interview, very similar to your phone screen. It'll be a little more in depth, and usually this will be harder technically, but you also get scenarios thrown at you. What would you do if X and Y happened? How would you handle this situation with a coworker? What would you do if you're going to miss this deadline? Things like that. Make sure to ask them questions here. This is another great spot to learn about the company and about the team. What are the expectations for success in this role? What does the work style of the team look like? Things like that. Remember, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. Next up is coding. You'll probably have a couple coding tests. This will be a more in-depth version of an online coding test, usually on a whiteboard. The problems are going to grow with each iteration, and we're going to build on them. Be prepared that once you solve iteration 1, you should be able to answer time and space complexity, and then move on to iteration 2, answer time and space complexity. Remember what we talked about before, do the basics, brute force, and then iterate for performance. Often the interviewers will keep making the questions harder to find the edge of your knowledge. And finding the edge of your knowledge isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean you failed the interview, but it does help the interviewers level you and figure out where you sit. Now for the system design, this again is going to vary greatly based on the role. This is usually going to be on whiteboard as well. You'll be drawing system designs. You should be ready to discuss and think about, system design concerns, scaling concerns, trade-offs, things like that. Make sure to ask scoping questions early, so gather requirements, scaling expectations, all of that. One pro tip here too is if you're on a whiteboard, write down the requirements on the whiteboard. Write down the scaling expectations. You're going to be nervous in this process. It's going to be long. You're going to be drawing things. You don't want to miss something. It helps to have that written down so you can quickly reference it. You'll have lunch at some point. This is usually just with an engineer on the team or someone from the company. This will be casual. This is not graded, but they can probably still veto you if it goes poorly. So be nice, but be yourself. And then at some point, you'll have the debrief with the recruiter. Make sure to ask about next steps so you're not left wondering. And then you wait. So here for Admin Corp, we're going to wait a week before we hear back. Then we hear back from the recruiter. All right, you got an offer. So the offer is not the end of the job interview process, though. The offer starts the negotiation process. This will depend on your level, your position in the market, how large the company is. The key to negotiating is to know what you're worth, and the best way to do that is to have multiple offers. So I always recommend going through multiple interviews at once. The first offer is rarely the final offer, and no decent company is going to rescind your offer because you asked for more within reason. So keep in mind, this is business. It's not personal. Don't get emotional. Also keep in mind that total compensation, is your salary plus your equity plus your benefits. It's not just the salary. And a lot of companies that can't compete on salary may be able to compete on benefits somewhere else. Maybe able to compete on hours or flexibility. For example, a lot of companies can't budge on salary because they had salary caps, but they can budge on stock. Non-salary comp can make up a surprising amount of total comp. So it's not abnormal for someone at a thing to make, say, $150,000 salary and $150,000 in equity. Get paid. All right, some parting thoughts. We're out of time here. Practice. If you're not used to it, get a whiteboard. Buy a whiteboard and practice coding and writing system designs on a whiteboard. It's a really weird feeling. It's not natural because we're used to typing all day. Doesn't hurt to practice it. Do hours of leak code. Make sure you feel very comfortable solving leak code style problems. Make yourself solve for time and space complexity. Ask friends, peers to give you mock interviews, to give you some of that pressure and help you get used to the process of explaining yourself. Again, interview for multiple companies. That is really the main cheat code to getting the most you can out of an offer. And also keep in mind, you get better and more comfortable at interviewing the more you do it. So your sixth interview, you're going to be a lot more comfortable than you are in your first. It's pretty normal to go through, say, half a dozen interviews before you get an offer, depending on the types of roles you're applying for. Make sure you had some examples prepped of stories, successful, failed projects, difficult projects, getting consensus, technologies you've used when they're trade-offs, things like that. Here's a tweet by the creator of Homebrew. So he interviewed at Google and he wasn't accepted. Now he's a great engineer, but that didn't show through in his interview. So I really want to impart to you to be prepared and to showcase your engineering ability through the interview. And you can only do that by being prepared for it. Here's some resources if you want to dig in further. These slides will be shared later, I assume, so you can grab the links off of there. And if you want to reach out to me later, I'll be in the breakout room, but you can also reach me on Twitter at Ben Edmunds or via email, ben.edmunds@gmail.com. At Wayfair, we're hiring for .NET, Java, and Python senior engineers. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out. And that's all I have.
All right. Ben, thank you so much. That was great. And that's just so much jam-packed information for anyone going out there and interviewing. Even if you're cozy in the job you have now, you'll eventually need to do it again in your career. So I don't know. This information is great. So let's get to it. Let's get to the Q&A stuff. Someone's curious. I've had a few interviews, but I never get past the interview piece to get on site. Is there any particular recommendations you would have to get to that on-site phase?
Yeah, so I try to think through this as really, it's a funnel, and think through it as an engineering problem, right? Like, where are you losing users in this process? So if you're not making it past the, say, the hiring manager phone screen, you probably need to have better stories relating to the roles you're applying for. For examples throughout your career where you solve the things you're looking for. If you're not making it through the coding test, then that's pretty easy. You just need to really buckle down on the leak code and the algos and make sure you can get through leak code problems without any stress. They feel easy and natural to you, and then you should start acing the coding test.
I like it. All right, cool. So, as you kind of mentioned in the talk, you get to a certain phase in the on-site where they keep ramping up difficulty. What does happen when you get to that question? You just don't know the answer. What's a good way to kind of navigate through that piece?
I try to think of this as just being very honest with where you don't know. Describe what you're thinking about the problem and where you're hitting that gap. Maybe, so one example, I was in an interview once and they wanted me to increase the time complexity or decrease the time complexity of the problem, right? I talked through some ideas I had, and then I talked through how I hit the wall in those ideas. And then I just said, yeah, I'm not sure how to do this any further. I'd be happy to think about this further if you want, but I also don't want to use all your time. So that's where I'm stopped right now.
Okay, great. I like that a lot. Okay, so there's a couple pieces in the talk as well that you mentioned, leveling and kind of how they rank up the difficulty and as well as leveling. Can you kind of dive a little bit more into that, what you mean by that leveling piece during the interview process?
Yeah, so different companies have different levels, right? So like a junior engineer might be an L1, like level 1 engineer. Standard engineer might be a level 2, senior engineer level 3, staff engineer level 4. So that's what I mean by leveling. So the level you're at usually determines both kind of your job expectations, your salary, your comp, and things like that. And so a lot of times that level will be determined during the interview process. It's usually tagged based on the role you apply for, but then it also might change the interview process. So if you apply for a junior engineer role, but you ace the interview, you might actually get like a mid-level engineering offer.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So just like this conference going virtual, some of these interview pieces are going virtual. So what do either on-sites look like in COVID or remote interviewing look like in COVID? Anything else that folks should be aware of to prepare?
Yeah, this is going to depend a lot on the company. So I have worked at remote companies in the past, and usually we were very heavy on the take-home test. So we wouldn't do too much actually live one-on-one. We would just do the behavioral interviews that way. And most of the technical interviews were offline. You take it home, you send it back in, kind of thing. I've seen different things from other companies now, though, as they try to just quickly adapt their process to this. And so I've seen a lot doing, like maybe you have a 2-hour call a couple days in a row that mostly mimics the current process. And yeah, I would ask a lot of questions to the recruiter on how they're handling that and exactly what to expect.
Nice. Okay, cool. So one of the other things you mentioned was pattern matching, right? And the value of that. So different questions get presented in different ways. Can you give me an example of pattern matching and how that can kind of help you in this process?
Yeah, actually, let me share my screen. I
Sure.
have a slide that I took out that shows an example of this. All right, let me know when you can see it. All right. So,
okay, looks good.
So this is an example I took out actually of the leveling, so that might help illustrate that last point too of how different companies might level. But so here's an example of two problems asked in a different way, or one problem asked in two different ways. So given an array, you have to sort the most common child names. Or giving products, sort them alphabetically, and then also sort them based on popularity. So I'll give everyone a second just to parse that. So these are described in very different ways. They sound like very different problems, but if you break this out into pieces, you could use Quicksort to solve both of these. So for the child names, you would just do one sort, one Quicksort, you're done. For the sidebar problem, you would sort on popularity. You could filter that to the top 10, and then you would sort again alphabetically. And so it looks like this, right? So child names, you're just doing the one Quicksort. And then for products, you're doing a Quicksort. You're slicing the top 10, and then you're doing another Quicksort. So that's one example.
Okay. Awesome. All right, let's see what else I got here. Someone from the chat is asking, for someone who's trying to break into a DevOps SRE role, what are things that can be done to strengthen their candidacy?
So Kubernetes, of course, is very hot and popular right now as a service mesh. I would make sure you have verifiable ways of showing your knowledge in that space. So there are some certification you can get in Kubernetes. Try to throw up maybe a GitHub project or an open source project that utilizes different technologies that you use in DevOps. Make sure you work out a pipeline for your project, right? Maybe use GitHub Actions, and just try to find ways to showcase that you understand the technology you would use in a DevOps role and you actually know how to implement it. And so just a project example would be a great way to do that.
Nice. We've got another question from the chat. George, how would you start a salary negotiation without seeming greedy? Like, what is the most appropriate wording to ask for more than they actually have offered initially?
Yeah, in general, silence is going to be your friend, and it depends on who you're talking to. So a lot of times you get an offer, you get a question. Feel free to just let a little silence leak in there, right? Just take a minute to consider it. That lets people know you're not just jumping at whatever they're saying. You're really considering it, taking time. If you're talking to the recruiter, you can be a little more relaxed than this. But if you're at like a startup and you're talking to the founder, it's going to be a little more stressful. Be sure to just say, okay, so that salary is okay, but truthfully, that's a little less than I hoped for. Can you do any better? Keep it open-ended. Could you move on the equity at all? Can we talk about the vacation days, right? So you're not being pushy as much as you're saying, hey, this doesn't work for me. This doesn't match my expectations. Is there anything we can do to get closer to where we both need to be? And so come at it as that, like, we're working together to mutually find an answer to this.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us here. Do you have any parting thoughts before we close out?
No, just feel free to reach out. Ben Edmunds on Twitter. I'd be happy to talk to anybody. My DMs are open.
All right, I love it. Ben Edmunds, get paid. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. We're going to hop over to the breakout session in a bit as well. And we're going to have a brief break quickly. And then all of us organizers are going to say a quick goodbye on the main.